Take a plastic bottle cap, drop it on the floor of a factory, and depending on where you work, that cap might get swept up, ground back into powder, melted down, and turned into a new cap by tomorrow morning. I've talked to people who've worked injection molding lines for 20 years, and they'll tell you that process is so routine that nobody even thinks about it anymore. It has a name, regrind. And it's one of the most common, least talked about practices in all of plastic manufacturing. It's also the reason why some products feel slightly different from batch to batch, why engineers argue over percentages at 8 in the morning, and why certain industries won't go anywhere near the stuff. So let's walk through what actually happens inside a factory when plastic goes wrong, and why throwing it away is almost never the first option anyone reaches for. When you're running injection molding or extrusion, you generate waste constantly. There are sprues, those little connector channels left over when molten plastic fills a mold. There are runners, the pathways the material travels before it reaches the part cavity. There are rejected parts that come off the line with sink marks, short shots, warping, surface defects. In a facility running 24 hours, this adds up fast. On some production lines, waste rates sit between 5 and 15% of total material used. So manufacturers grind it, the scrap goes into a granulator, a machine with hardened steel blades rotating at high speed, and comes out as irregular flakes or coarse pellets a few millimeters across. That's regrind. It looks a lot like virgin plastic pellets, but it isn't. And that difference matters more than most people outside the industry ever think about. Here's where I want to slow down because the chemistry is actually the interesting part. Most plastics are long molecular chains, polymers. When you heat polypropylene or nylon or polycarbonate and push it through a mold under high pressure, those chains get stressed, they stretch, they shear, and they partially break down. Cool the part, grind it up, heat it again, and the same degradation happens a second time. Engineers call this thermal degradation, and with each heat cycle, the polymer chains get shorter. Shorter chains change how the material flows, reduce its strength in measurable ways, and can alter the surface finish of whatever comes out of the mold next. For polypropylene, which shows up in everything from food containers to automotive trim, you can typically run 1 or 2 regrind cycles before mechanical properties start drifting in ways that matter. For nylon, thermal degradation moves faster and hits harder. For PVC, repeated heating is a real processing headache. It can start releasing small amounts of hydrogen chloride, which is both a contamination concern and a safety issue on the production floor. Every material has its own tolerance, and experienced process engineers track it closely. A 2019 study in the journal Polymer Degradation and Stability followed polypropylene through multiple processing cycles and documented measurable reductions in impact strength starting at the 3rd cycle. By the 5th cycle, elongation at break, basically how far the material stretches before it snaps, had dropped roughly 40% compared to virgin material. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between a car interior panel that survives a cold weather impact test and one that doesn't. So how do factories actually control this? They blend. The standard practice across automotive suppliers, consumer electronics manufacturers, and packaging producers is to mix a defined percentage of regrind back into the virgin material feed. You'll hear engineers talk about a 10% blend or 20 or sometimes 30 depending on the application. The logic is straightforward. You dilute the degraded material enough that the finished part still meets its mechanical specification. A packaging plant producing food containers might run at 10 to 15% regrind content. A facility making garden furniture or industrial bins, where optical clarity doesn't matter and tolerances are generous, might push that number higher. An automotive interior trim supplier working under ISO 9001 certification and specific OEM requirements will have that percentage written into their process documentation and audited on a regular schedule. That word audited is where it gets serious, because without disciplined tracking, regrind percentages drift. The hopper gets loaded heavy with scrap. An operator tops it off without logging the weight. You end up running a batch at 40% regrind that behaves differently in the mold, produces parts that are slightly more brittle, and maybe clears visual inspection but fails 6 months later in someone's hands. That's when the warranty claims start, and that's when the root cause investigation leads right back to the granulator room. The best run facilities handle this with what's called a regrind passport, a chain of custody document that tracks how many heat cycles a specific batch of material has been through. Every time it runs through a machine, the count increments. Once it hits the limit defined in the material specification, it either gets downgraded to a lower tier product line or it gets disposed of. It doesn't go back into the premium product. That's the quality management system doing what it's supposed to do. The system breaks down when cost pressure overrides discipline, and in competitive plastic manufacturing, cost pressure is basically a permanent condition. There are industries that skip regrind almost entirely, and it's worth understanding which ones and why, because the reasoning is pretty revealing. Medical device manufacturing is the clearest example. Components that contact patients, syringe bodies, IV housings, surgical instrument casings, are almost universally made from 100% virgin material. FDA regulations under 21 CFR don't outright ban regrind in medical applications, but validation requirements are strict enough that most manufacturers won't take the variability risk. If your process was validated using virgin polycarbonate and you introduce regrind, you've changed the process inputs. That means revalidation. That's months of testing and significant cost. So the answer is usually just don't use regrind. Optical components work the same way. A polycarbonate lens housing for safety goggles or precision instruments needs consistent light transmission and surface quality across every single part. Even low-level contamination from regrind can introduce microscopic haze or color shift that fails inspection. Virgin material only. Food contact packaging sits in the middle. FDA rules permit recycled content under specific conditions, primarily that the material doesn't migrate anything harmful into the food it touches. Most food-grade regrind programs restrict themselves to clean in-process scrap from the same production line, material that's never left the building and never been exposed to outside contamination. That's a very different situation from post-consumer recycled content, and the distinction matters legally and technically. Now, here's something that genuinely surprised me the first time I dug into this. Regrind isn't always a compromise. In certain applications, engineers actually prefer it for specific technical reasons. Some processes benefit from slightly shorter polymer chains because they flow more easily under heat and pressure. In certain film extrusion operations, engineers will deliberately blend in a percentage of regrind to tune the melt flow index, the measurement of how easily a melted plastic moves through a die or mold at a given temperature and pressure. Virgin material alone can be too viscous for the process to run efficiently and produce uniform wall thickness. A controlled regrind addition solves that problem. It's not a workaround, it's a formulation decision. There's also the contamination argument running in the opposite direction. Virgin pellets arrive from a supplier who may have stored them in a warehouse for months, shipped them across multiple states, and handled them through several transfer points. In-process regrind collected directly from a granulator on the production floor. Same material type, same day. Controlled environment can actually arrive at the blending hopper in cleaner condition than some incoming virgin feedstock. As long as material types are kept strictly separated, in-process regrind is a well understood and often underappreciated input. That separation issue is where a lot of facilities quietly fail, and it deserves a direct look. Plastic resins look similar. Black polypropylene pellets and black ABS pellets are nearly indistinguishable by eye. If a regrind collection system even occasionally mixes them, you end up with a contaminated blend. So when polypropylene and ABS are melted together, they don't bond at the molecular level. The result is a material with degraded mechanical properties, potential delamination between layers, and failure modes that no engineer designed for. In injection molding, contaminated regrind shows up as surface streaks, layer lines, discoloration, and parts that crack in ways that look random but aren't. Dedicated labeled bins, color-coded collection systems on the floor, granulating and storing by material type. These aren't suggestions that get posted on a quality bulletin board. They're the operational foundation of any regrind program that holds up over time. The factories that skip this step tend to find out at the worst possible moment, usually during a customer audit or a product liability investigation. In 2026, there's a real tension building in this industry between sustainability mandates and material performance requirements, and it's worth being honest about how uncomfortable that tension actually is. Major brands are under serious regulatory and public pressure to increase post-consumer recycled content in their products. The EU's updated packaging regulations and various US state-level laws are pushing minimum thresholds that manufacturers now have to hit on paper. But post-consumer recycled plastic, material that came from actual consumer waste, went through curbside collection, sorting facilities, cleaning, and reprocessing, is fundamentally different from clean and process regrind. It carries an unknown contamination history, variable heat exposure, UV degradation from outdoor use, and often traces of other material types that sorting didn't catch. Managing post-consumer recycled content in structural or precision parts isn't a matter of swapping in 25% and adjusting one process parameter. Material scientists spend real time characterizing incoming recycled feedstock lot by lot, running accelerated aging tests, and sometimes redesigning wall thicknesses or rib geometries to compensate for reduced impact strength. When that work is done properly, it represents genuine progress towards circular economy manufacturing. When it's rushed to hit a compliance deadline, you get quality problems that end up in field returns, and that erodes consumer confidence in recycled content across the board, which helps nobody. The honest summary is this: regrind is a mature, well-understood practice when manufacturers treat it with the discipline it requires, track the material, define hard limits on processing cycles, keep your material streams clean and separated, know which applications can absorb the variability and which ones genuinely cannot. Those factories run efficient operations without sacrificing part quality. The failures happen when regrind gets treated purely as a cost line item with no supporting infrastructure. When the tracking disappears, when the bins get mixed, when the regrind percentage climbs without documentation, you eventually produce something that fails in the field. And the investigation always leads back to the same place, a granulator that was running without enough oversight. So the next time you're holding a plastic product, a car interior panel, a toolbox, a storage bin, and it feels somehow different from one you bought 5 years ago from the same brand, there's a real chance that answer lives somewhere in that regrind percentage and the quality management decisions that surrounded it. Here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever noticed a quality difference in a plastic product you've bought more than once? Same brand, same item, but noticeably different in how it feels or how long it lasted? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and I'm genuinely curious what people are actually observing out there. If this kind of content is useful to you, subscribe. We dig into the engineering and manufacturing decisions behind everyday products, and there's a lot more of this coming. Thanks for watching.